Before we begin, take a quiet moment. If you're watching this, you likely remember a time when the world still spoke in static and signal, when words carried across oceans on fragile radio waves. Like, comment, and subscribe to Ghosts of WWII, not for the algorithm, but for remembrance. Because some stories should never fade, and this one belongs to a generation who turned language itself into a weapon. At first they laughed. Even within the ranks of the U.S. military, few believed it would work. Indians talking on the radio? Officers smirked behind their coffee cups. The idea sounded like a desperate gimmick. To the average staff officer in 1942, Native Americans belonged to history books and old photographs, not the battlefield. But the Pacific War had a problem that no amount of artillery could solve. The Japanese were listening. By then, Japan's cryptographers were among the best in the world. They cracked Allied codes faster than the Americans could invent new ones. Orders sent in the morning were compromised by nightfall. Convoys ambushed, attacks anticipated, lives lost. Every transmission was a risk. The Marines needed a cipher no one could break, something faster, purer, alive. The answer didn't come from Washington or from Harvard mathematicians. It came from the mesas of the American Southwest, from young men who grew up herding sheep, speaking a language no outsider had ever fully learned: Navajo. The idea began with a single Marine, Philip Johnston, a World War I veteran and the son of missionaries who had grown up among the Navajo Nation. He understood something most white officers did not: that the Navajo tongue wasn't just complex, it was impenetrable. No written form, no alphabet, no linguistic bridge to English or Japanese. Even among other tribes, it was foreign. Johnston walked into Marine Corps headquarters in early 1942 and made his pitch. A code that couldn't be broken because it wasn't a code at all. It was a living language. The brass humored him at first. They set up a test at Camp Elliott, California. 2 Navajo Marines were placed in separate rooms. They were given a random English message, ordered to transmit it in Navajo and have it decoded on the other end. When the translation came through, perfect, clear, instantaneous, the officers were stunned. One colonel reportedly said, "Gentlemen, we've just seen the birth of a new secret weapon." But not everyone was convinced. Some called it a novelty, others a waste of time. "They'll never keep up under fire," one skeptical officer muttered. "They'll freeze like everyone else." He was wrong. The first group of 29 Navajo recruits, the original Code Talkers, trained relentlessly at Camp Pendleton. They built a coded dictionary of over 200 military terms, each disguised through metaphor. A fighter plane became hummingbird, a battleship, whale, a hand grenade, potato. To an untrained ear, it sounded like casual conversation. To the Marines, it was life or death. When the training was done, they shipped out to the Pacific. The first stop, Guadalcanal. The Japanese had no idea what was coming. The Code Talkers' radios crackled to life on the beaches, their voices calm, rhythmic, unshaken. "Nasha," one would say. "I am moving forward." Within minutes, they relayed coordinates for artillery, troop positions, and airstrikes faster than any machine cipher in existence. What took hours with codebooks now took seconds. A single Navajo operator could send and receive hundreds of messages in the time it took for a typist to clear his throat. The Japanese interceptors were baffled. "It sounds like a tribal chant," one reported. Their cryptographers called it the most bewildering transmission ever recorded. For the first time in the Pacific War, American orders moved faster than the enemy's ability to respond. Battles began to tilt, not because of bigger guns, but because of better words. Still, the Code Talkers were not celebrated. They were Marines, yes, but Marines who faced mockery even in uniform. Some white soldiers called them chiefs or savages. Others refused to share tents. Yet, when the shells started falling and radios failed, it was those same men the others came running to. "Get the Navajos on the line," they'd shout. "They'll get it through." Under fire, they stayed calm. Their discipline was sacred, their duty absolute. Many carried the memory of their grandfathers who had walked the long walk, the forced march that once tried to erase their people. Now, speaking their forbidden tongue, they were saving Americans by the thousands. History has its ironies. At Guadalcanal, one young code talker named Chester Nez sent a transmission while mortar shells burst around him. The message, "Enemy approaching ridge, 20 men, request air support." It reached command in under 30 seconds. Minutes later, the ridge vanished under a curtain of bombs. The Japanese counterattack was erased before it began. His sergeant later said, "That's the first time I've ever heard victory sound like a song." By early 1943, word spread through the Pacific. The Navajos could do what no code machine could. Officers started requesting them by name at Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and Peleliu. They would become the spine of Marine communications. One general later estimated that without them, the campaign could have lasted months longer and cost tens of thousands more lives. But in those early months, they were still the punchline to a joke they'd never been invited to tell. They didn't correct anyone. They didn't need to. They had the truth, and the truth was winning. When night fell on Guadalcanal, the jungle went silent except for the soft hum of radios. Two voices drifted through the darkness, steady, low, almost musical. It wasn't English. It wasn't Japanese. It was something older, purer, carved from centuries of resilience. Men who had been taught to hide their language were now using it to save the world. If you've ever heard a veteran speak of the Pacific, you know the tone, that slow reverence that comes when memory meets pride. These men carried not just rifles, but an entire civilization on their backs, and though few understood them, everyone depended on them. The laughter stopped. The radios kept speaking, and the Japanese, for the first time, could not listen in. For those who remember, this part will hit home. By 1943, the Pacific had become a map of scattered names: Bougainville, Tarawa, Saipan, each one a test of endurance written in coral and blood. The Marines were learning that in the jungle, time was the true enemy. Orders had to travel faster than death could. That was when the Navajos came fully into their own. On Bougainville, the morning haze clung low to the palms. The air smelled of diesel and sweat. The Marines of the 3rd Division crouched behind sandbags, radios crackling. Japanese artillery zeroed in on their position. Each second counted. Sergeant Joe Kiyumiya, one of the few Navajos fluent in both languages, switched channels and spoke rapidly into his handset. The words flowed like water, calm and steady. His partner, Private Begay, translated back to English for the artillery crews less than a minute later. Within moments, American howitzers fired a perfect counter-barrage. The incoming shells that should have killed them instead detonated harmlessly in the trees beyond. It was like thunder arguing with thunder, one Marine recalled. That efficiency was no accident. The Navajo Code was the only spoken cipher in the world that could operate without mechanical assistance. No code books to burn, no machines to jam, no delays. Each man carried the dictionary in his head. Their memories became encryption devices, their tongues the signal keys. Messages that once took 30 minutes to encode now took 20 seconds. And not a single transmission was ever broken. Still, skepticism lingered. New officers arriving from the States often stared at the dark-haired men with curious suspicion. "You really trust them?" some whispered. "How do we know they aren't speaking Japanese?" But after the first week in combat, those doubts vanished. When a company was pinned and the radios screamed for help, no one cared about accents anymore. They only cared that the voice on the other end answered. On Saipan, the fighting turned feral. The heat itself felt hostile. Marines dug shallow foxholes that filled with rain before they could sleep. At night, Japanese infiltrators crept through the cane fields, whispering in perfect English, "Corpsmen, this way." It fooled many units, but not the Navajos. Their language had no openings for deception. When they spoke, the rhythm and tone were unmistakable. "We always knew who was ours," one veteran later said. Among them was Private First Class Samuel Holliday, a tall, soft-spoken Navajo who'd grown up near Monument Valley. His call sign was Turtle. During one battle, he transmitted non-stop for 17 hours, calling artillery, coordinating tank movements, relaying casualty reports. When his commanding officer finally ordered him to rest, Holliday refused. "As long as I can talk," he said. "We're still winning." Back home, newspapers never printed their names. The code was top secret. Even fellow Marines outside the signal chain didn't know how it worked. The code talkers couldn't write home about it, couldn't tell their families what they were doing. To most Americans, they were simply radio men. Only those who fought beside them knew the truth, that without those quiet voices, the Pacific Campaign might have drowned in confusion. For many of you watching now, raised on the victory headlines of those years, you remember the photographs, beachheads under black smoke, Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi. What you didn't see in the frame were the Navajos kneeling beside the radios, translating chaos into coherence. If you value their service, take a second now to like this video and subscribe to Ghosts of WWII, because these men fought not only enemies abroad, but prejudice at home, and they deserve to be remembered. The deeper the Marines pushed into the islands, the heavier the resistance became, and the stronger the trust grew. At Iwo Jima, each regiment had at least 2 code talkers embedded with forward companies. In the first 48 hours, they sent and received more than 800 messages without error. General Howard Connor would later say, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." Yet recognition never came during the war. After missions, while others celebrated, the code talkers packed up their radios and faded back into the ranks. They didn't brag. Their orders forbade it. Even among themselves, they spoke little about what they'd done. They understood something profound, that the power of language isn't in being heard, it's in being understood by those who need it most. When the guns finally cooled on Saipan and the Marines counted their dead, one of the commanding officers sent a single line back to headquarters. "The Navajos are worth their weight in divisions." It was true their invisible war was being fought on the airwaves. Sentence by sentence, they had turned conversation into camouflage. But the cost was quiet. Many of them carried home not glory, but questions about loyalty, about identity, about a country that had only recently allowed their people to vote. They fought for a nation that had tried to erase their language, and by speaking it, they saved that same nation's sons. There is no irony more American than that. When the sun set over the Pacific, the radios glowed faintly in the dark. The code talkers' voices drifted through static, half prayer, half poetry. "Enemy withdrawing," they'd say. "Mission complete." And somewhere in those fading words was a truth that transcended the battlefield. Language, when born of survival, is the purest form of strength. Later, one Marine sergeant remembered how strange it felt when the radios finally went silent after the ceasefire. "For months I'd fall asleep to that sound," he said. "Those Navajo words, soft and steady. When it stopped, the jungle felt too empty, like the heartbeat of the war was gone." They had been mocked once, dismissed, underestimated, ignored. But by the war's middle years, their voices were the pulse of every victory in the Pacific. Every message that got through meant another platoon alive, another beach secured, another dawn. And though the world didn't yet know their names, the men who fought beside them did. They would never forget the sound of a Navajo word cutting through the static like a lifeline. For those who remember, the sound of their voices still echoes in the wind. The air over Iwo Jima was heavy with sulfur and smoke, a place that looked like the end of the earth. In February 1945, 21,000 Japanese soldiers waited underground, hidden in miles of tunnels carved from volcanic rock. For the Marines who stormed the beaches that morning, it was like landing on the moon under fire. Among the first waves were 6 Navajo Code Talkers assigned to the 5th Marine Division. They jumped from landing craft into chest-deep surf, radios strapped to their backs, sand whipping like glass against their faces. Bullets hissed through the air like insects. One of them, Private First Class Ira Hayes, would later help raise the flag on Mount Suribachi. But in those first hours, no one thought about photographs or symbols. They thought only about surviving the next minute. The Code Talkers dug shallow pits into the black sand, set up their field radios, and went to work. Their voices, calm and deliberate, carried through the static, coordinates, fire missions, casualty counts. They spoke as if reciting prayer. "The words came from our grandfathers," one of them said later. "When we spoke them, we felt protected." Japanese artillery zeroed in on the signals, but they couldn't decipher the meaning. They jammed frequencies, tried triangulating positions. Nothing worked. Within the first 48 hours, Navajo operators sent more than 800 critical messages. Every one of them was received correctly. Not one error, not one interception. In the chaos of Iwo Jima, time itself lost shape. Day and night blended into one long roar. Marines fought for yards, not miles. The Code Talkers worked without rest, their throats raw from speaking, their hands blistered from the heat of the radio tubes. They ate cold rations, drank from canteens filled with sulfur-tinged water, and kept talking. Their words guided artillery, coordinated airstrikes, and saved countless lives. A lieutenant once asked one of them, "How can you stay so calm under this hell?" The Code Talker looked up from his handset and said, "Because this language was born in hard places. The war just borrowed it for a while. Back home, no one knew their names." The newspapers showed Joe Rosenthal's photograph of the flag rising above the island, a picture that captured the pride of a nation. But behind that image were hundreds of invisible transmissions, messages that made the moment possible. Each syllable of Navajo carried the weight of generations who had survived their own wars long before the 20th century ever began. When the battle finally ended after 36 days, Iwo Jima looked less like victory and more like the surface of a dead world. Nearly 7,000 Americans were gone. For the Navajo, every name on the casualty list felt personal. Many of them had grown up in boarding schools where their language was beaten out of them. Now that same language had brought them home alive. "I used to be punished for speaking it," said Samuel Holliday years later. "Out there, they begged me to." For those who remember the war, you know that feeling. When pride mixes with pain, when triumph tastes like ashes. If this story stirs something in you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Ghosts of WWII. Every act of remembrance keeps these men's voices from fading into static. After Iwo Jima, their reputation spread quietly, but completely. Commanders stopped calling them experiments. They were now essential personnel. At Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific, more than 400 Code Talkers operated across 13 Marine battalions. Their radios ran day and night. The Japanese tried one last time to decode their transmissions, even capturing fragments, but the effort collapsed. "It is not code," one frustrated officer wrote in his report. "It is a madness of syllables." For the Navajo, it was music, the rhythm of home amid horror. They spoke of mountains and eagles, turtles and horses, words that meant danger and courage, translated into coordinates and commands. A world that had once called them primitive was now depending on their precision. In May 1945, as the guns fell silent over Okinawa, the radio networks went quiet. Some of the code talkers sat on the edge of their foxholes, listening to the ocean. For the first time in months, they could hear the wind again. One man, Corporal Wilson Price, remembered thinking, "It sounded like home after the storm." The officers congratulated them, shook hands, promised recognition after the war. But when the war ended and the code was declassified, silence returned. They went home to reservations where electricity was still rare, to families who hadn't heard their voices in years. No parades, no medals, only peace. And even that felt strange. Back on the mesas of Arizona and New Mexico, the veterans struggled to adjust. Some couldn't sleep without the hum of a radio nearby. Others found themselves slipping into English out of habit, their native words feeling heavier than before. One man said he missed the sound of static because it meant he was needed. In 1948, 3 years after the war, a letter arrived at the Navajo Tribal Council from a Marine general. It read simply, "The United States Marine Corps owes its success in the Pacific to many men, but none gave us greater security than those who spoke the code that could not be broken." No one had mocked them since, but the nation they'd saved still didn't quite know them. Their language remained a secret, their contribution hidden under classification stamps until 1968. By then, many had already passed away, their stories buried with them. When the truth finally came out, reporters asked how it felt to be recognized so late. One old code talker smiled and said, "We always knew we didn't do it for headlines. We did it so our boys could go home." That line could have been carved into stone, because beneath every victory in the Pacific lay the quiet certainty of their voices, strong, patient, unbreakable. In every battle where radios once screamed and men bled, the memory of those words still lingers, carried by wind over the Pacific waves. And when the last Navajo transmission signed off at the war's end, the operator paused for a moment before powering down. His final words were simple. "Mission complete. We are returning home." For those who remember, that silence meant the world was safe again. The war ended with parades, music, and ticker tape fluttering down on Times Square. But far from New York and San Francisco, on the red mesas of Arizona and New Mexico, there were no bands waiting. The Navajo Code Talkers came home quietly, stepping off trains with duffel bags over their shoulders, medals tucked inside envelopes, their uniforms still smelling faintly of the Pacific. To most Americans, the war was over. To them, it just went silent. Many had been gone for years. They returned to homes without electricity, to dirt roads and families that had aged while they were gone. Their parents spoke Navajo, their children spoke English, and somewhere between those two worlds, the veterans stood, bridges between old and new, ancient and modern, remembered and forgotten. They were under strict orders not to speak about their work. The code was still classified. Not even their wives could know what they'd done. "We were told to keep it secret," one veteran said. "So we did. We were Marines. We followed orders." For decades, the world moved on. Korea came, then Vietnam, and the story of the Navajos faded into the background noise of history. Many found work as laborers, ranchers, or miners. Some wrestled with what we now call trauma, though no one had words for it then. They dreamed in static and woke in sweat. But when neighbors asked about the war, they simply smiled and said, "We helped." That was all. In 1952, one code talker, his name lost to the record, applied for a job at a radio station. The manager looked at his application and chuckled. "You?" he said. "You probably don't even know how to use one of these." The veteran just nodded, shook his hand, and walked out. He didn't need to prove anything. He already knew what his voice had done. The secrecy was both shield and burden. They couldn't boast, couldn't mourn publicly, couldn't explain to their children why they sometimes froze when they heard a radio crackle. For a people whose culture revolved around storytelling, silence became its own kind of exile. And yet, they endured it with grace, because they understood something the rest of the country didn't. Sometimes honor doesn't need an audience. Still, the world has a way of remembering what it forgets. In the mid-1960s, a Marine Corps historian researching Pacific operations stumbled upon after-action reports that mentioned an unbreakable voice code. He followed the trail, piecing together interviews, documents, and transcripts. What he found astonished him: a communication system faster, cleaner, and more reliable than any cipher machine of the era. In 1968, the U.S. government finally declassified the Navajo Code. For the first time, their story could be told. When the news reached the reservations, some veterans wept, not because they wanted fame, but because they could finally speak. One said, "I'd been waiting 20 years to tell my sons why I talk to the wind at night." Recognition came slowly. The Pentagon held small ceremonies, newspapers wrote articles, and Hollywood made its versions of the story, some faithful, others less so. But the truth didn't need embellishment. The truth was enough. By the 1980s, many of the original code talkers were in their 60s and 70s. They'd lived long enough to see their grandchildren learn the language schools once forbade. On the reservation, bilingual teachers began using the war as proof that Navajo wasn't a relic, it was a resource. One teacher told her class, "This language saved a nation. Don't you ever let anyone tell you it's worthless." For many of you watching now, that might sound familiar, the feeling of finally being seen after a lifetime of being overlooked. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Ghosts of WWII, not for numbers, but for memory. Every story we preserve here keeps the past breathing, keeps men like these from being buried twice. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan signed a proclamation officially designating August 14th as National Navajo Code Talkers Day. It wasn't a holiday for sale signs or fireworks, it was a quiet tribute, a whisper of thanks. At the ceremony, a small group of surviving code talkers stood in their Marine uniforms, hats tilted slightly in the sun. They spoke softly to one another in Navajo, smiling as they remembered friends long gone. The press cameras clicked. Reporters asked them how it felt to finally be recognized. One of them, with a weathered face and a grin like the desert horizon, said, "We were never waiting for thanks. We were waiting for the next generation to listen." When he finished, the crowd stood in silence. No anthem, no cheer, just the weight of understanding, the kind that takes 40 years to arrive. Afterward, a boy approached him with a small American flag in his hand. "My grandfather said you saved him," the boy said shyly. The old Marine placed his hand on the child's shoulder and replied, "Then your grandfather saved me too." That was their legacy. Connection through courage, unity through difference. In a time when America often divided itself by color, belief, or language, these men had proven that diversity wasn't weakness, it was strength and camouflage. In the years that followed, the surviving code talkers traveled across the country, speaking at schools and memorials. They visited the Pentagon, met presidents, and walked through the halls of museums that now bore their names. But the moments they cherished most weren't on stages. They were the quiet ones, sitting beside other veterans at reunions, radios silent, hands folded, eyes distant. They didn't speak of war. They spoke of laughter, of letters from home, of the smell of rain after combat. One said, "The war took our youth, but it gave our words a home." Their home wasn't on paper, it was in memory, in the minds of those who cared enough to keep listening. Today, if you visit Window Rock, Arizona, you'll find a bronze statue of a young Marine kneeling beside his radio. His mouth is open, frozen mid-transmission. The plaque beneath reads simply, "In honor of the Navajo Code Talkers, whose words carried the message of victory." At sunrise, the light hits the statue just right, casting the shadow of his microphone across the red dust. For those who know what to listen for, it still sounds like a heartbeat. And for those who remember, that sound never really stopped. Time has a way of turning even thunder into whispers. By the 1990s, most of the original 29 Navajo Code Talkers were gone. Those who remained moved slower now, but their voices, those voices, hadn't lost their strength. When they spoke in Navajo, the sound carried like a prayer through the air, soft but sure, the same rhythm that once commanded fleets and saved battalions. Many of them had become local legends. School children visited their homes to ask questions. Veterans groups invited them to speak at reunions, and still, the men stayed humble. "I was just doing my job," they'd say, with that same gentle shrug familiar to anyone who's ever known a real Marine, but every word carried the weight of history. These weren't speeches, they were translations of memory. One of them, Chester Nez, was often asked if he ever felt bitter about how long it took America to thank them. He'd pause, smile faintly, and reply, "Bitter? No, we don't waste words that way." Then, switching to Navajo, he would recite the first phrase every code talker learned, "Ya'ate shi e dene," "It is good, I am Navajo." Those few words said more than any medal could. They spoke of identity reclaimed, of a people who turned the very thing used to suppress them into a shield for others. In that sense, their victory went far beyond the battlefield. By 2001, America finally delivered its highest recognition. The surviving Code Talkers were invited to Washington, D.C. to receive congressional gold medals. It was a humid July morning. The Capitol dome gleamed white in the sunlight as the men, now grandfathers and great-grandfathers, walked slowly up the steps in dress uniform. Some used canes, others leaned on each other. Their grandchildren followed close behind, holding cameras and flags. Inside, senators and generals waited, but the applause that filled the chamber wasn't for politics. It was for gratitude deferred too long. When the medals were placed around their necks, one veteran whispered, "It feels heavy." Another smiled and replied, "Good, so was the radio." The ceremony was simple, quiet, and perfect. There were no grand speeches about destiny or empire, just a shared silence that said everything. For those who remember watching the news that day, you might recall the close-up of their faces, deep lines, sun-worn skin, eyes that still carried the reflection of faraway seas. These were the last men who had spoken a language the enemy could never break. And now, at last, America was listening. Afterward, one of the younger Marines asked an old code talker what he remembered most from the war. The old man thought for a long moment and said, "The radio's hum." It never stopped. It sounded like breathing. When it went quiet, you knew someone's son wasn't coming home. He didn't cry. Men like him rarely did. He just looked out the window toward the Potomac, where the sunlight flickered like static on the water, and said softly, "That's why we kept talking." For the next 2 decades, the Code Talkers became symbols of endurance, not just for the military, but for America itself. Schools added their story to textbooks, documentaries played on PBS, narrated by voices that sounded like their own. Yet even as they received honors, the men never saw themselves as heroes. Heroes, one said, are the ones who didn't come back. We were just the messengers." He wasn't wrong. For those watching now, those who remember Pearl Harbor, Guadalcanal, or the first time you saw that flag go up on Iwo Jima, this story isn't about a code, it's about communication, about the idea that words, when used with purpose, can save lives. The Navajos didn't invent courage. They carried it across the Pacific, through fire and rain, through generations of silence and misunderstanding. They carried it. If this story resonates with you, if it reminds you of the veterans in your own family, take a moment now to like this video and subscribe to Ghosts of WWII, not for vanity, but for preservation. Because the time left to hear these voices firsthand is running out, and every listener becomes a steward of their memory. In their final years, many of the Code Talkers recorded their stories for archives and museums. They wanted their voices, not just their names, to endure. One of the last recordings ends with a soft laugh, followed by the words, "We spoke for the ones who couldn't." That was the whole point. That phrase, "the whole point," carried a simplicity only they could deliver. They never spoke about ideology or politics. To them, the war wasn't about flags. It was about duty, about the belief that if you could help another man live to see home again, you did it, no matter the color of your skin or the scars of your history. By the early 2000s, the youngest of the original 29 was gone. The ceremonies grew smaller, the photos fewer, but the echoes remained. On certain days at the Navajo Nation Museum, visitors stand before the original code dictionary encased in glass. The words are there, translated, documented, preserved. But for those who knew the voices, it's the sound that stays. They say if you stand quietly enough, you can almost hear it, the faint rhythm of speech flowing through the static of time. It isn't nostalgia, it's continuity. And somewhere, in a small house on the reservation, an old radio still sits on a shelf, its metal scratched, its dial frozen on the frequency of the past. When the wind blows through the open window, the static hums softly. A granddaughter once asked her grandfather why he never threw it away. He smiled and said, "Because someday, someone will turn it on, and they'll remember." He didn't mean the war. He meant the voice. For those who remember, that voice never died. It just learned to speak through us. The desert never forgets. When the evening wind moves across the mesas of Arizona, it carries a sound that feels almost familiar. Part breeze, part whisper, like distant radio static returning from another time. Out there, beneath the wide sky, the story of the Navajo Code Talkers doesn't rest in museums or medals. It lives in the earth itself, in the language that once carried freedom across the Pacific. By the 2020s, only a handful of the original men remained. Their hair silver, their hands marked by age, yet their voices, still steady, still warm, could quiet a crowd faster than any speech. When they spoke, people leaned forward, not out of curiosity, but out of reverence. The last of the living bridges between a century of silence and the generation that finally listened. One of them was Peter MacDonald, a former Marine sergeant and code talker who became the keeper of their legacy. In 2019, he stood before Congress in his turquoise bolo tie and red veteran's cap. The room fell silent as he began to speak. "We were America's secret weapon," he said, "but we were also America's forgotten warriors. We come here not for ourselves, but for those who never came home." His voice did not waver. Every syllable carried the gravity of 70 years of waiting. When he finished, the audience stood and applauded, but MacDonald simply nodded, folded his notes, and stepped away from the microphone. For men like him, applause was nice, but it was never the point. The point was remembrance. Back home on the reservation, local schools began teaching the Navajo language again, this time not as history, but as heritage. Children recited the same words their grandfathers once whispered into combat radios. They learned that turtle once meant a tank, that whale once meant battleship, that every word was a thread connecting two worlds, one ancient, one modern, woven together by necessity and faith. The teachers told them, "Your words once saved America." And for the first time in generations, no one laughed. When the last code talker passed away, the radios went silent once more. News anchors spoke of bravery, documentaries played grainy black and white footage, and for a week the country remembered flags were lowered, bugles played. And then, as the world always does, it moved on. But in the canyons and valleys of the Southwest, families kept the memory alive in simpler ways. By speaking Navajo around the dinner table, by teaching children to introduce themselves not in English, but in the tongue that could not be broken. A granddaughter once asked her grandfather why he never threw away his old field manual, still covered in salt and sand. He smiled and said, "Because one day you'll hold it and know what it cost to be heard." Those words became the closing line of a documentary years later, and when audiences heard them, many wiped tears they hadn't expected to shed, because deep down, everyone understands what silence costs, especially the generation that lived through World War. For those watching now, veterans, sons, daughters, grandchildren, this is your story too. You might remember the hum of the family radio on quiet evenings, the news bulletins, the swing music, the war updates that once made the world feel both huge and close at the same time. Somewhere among those transmissions, invisible but vital, were the voices of the code talkers. Their words rode the same frequencies, guiding ships, saving lives, keeping faith. If you value that memory, if you believe these stories still matter, take a second now to like this video and subscribe to Ghosts of WWII. Every view, every share, every comment is another echo of their legacy, another chance to make sure those radios never truly go silent again. Because remembrance isn't a monument, it's a decision. It's the choice to listen when the world grows loud with distraction. The choice to pass on the stories of the men who turned a language once forbidden into a force of liberation. The Navajo word for warrior, Navajo, doesn't just mean fighter. It means protector, one who stands guard for the people. That's what they were, not destroyers, but defenders. They didn't just carry rifles. They carried identity, culture, and the promise of unity. They proved that America's strength has always come from its differences working together toward something larger than themselves. In 2008, a statue was unveiled at the Pentagon. Bronze figures kneeling by a radio, the faces turned toward an unseen horizon. On its base are the words. They spoke to each other in a language the enemy could never understand, and the world will never forget. Visitors still leave coins and feathers at its feet. Some leave folded letters. One note, weathered by rain, reads, "Grandpa, I finally understand what you couldn't tell me." That's the gift they left behind, understanding, the kind that arrives not through speeches but through quiet truth. And though their bodies are gone, their voices remain. They live in recordings, in classrooms, in the soft cadence of prayers said at sunrise. The code they created is no longer a secret. It's a national treasure. And somewhere, maybe tonight, a radio operator sitting in a far-off desert post or aboard a naval ship will key his microphone and send a message home. His words will travel across the same invisible waves once carried by those Navajo syllables. And in that brief flash of transmission, their legacy continues. Because language, real language, never dies. It adapts, it survives, it finds new listeners. So, when the evening grows quiet and the static fades, remember this: they mocked the code talkers. They doubted their worth. They laughed at their language. Until the radios went silent and the world finally understood the power of their voice. For those who remember, may that voice never fade again.